Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to News and Views with Fazlin Franzman Talib on Salam Media. Today this particular segment is again focusing on Palestine. As we know, there's atrocities happening specifically in Gaza at the moment that has caught worldwide attention. But specifically, what we're going to focus on in this conversation is the idea or the concept or the utterances regarding the fact that Israeli troops are going to be withdrawing from certain sections of Gaza, specifically Khan Yunis and Rafah. And so we want to unpack what that means, whether we should take the utterances by Israeli officials as what they say, or whether there is some other tactic at play at the same time. And so to help us unpack this and obviously more, we have Professor Jeff Halper, who's an Israeli-American anthropologist, author, lecturer, and political activist. And he's the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Good day, Professor. How are you doing?
Okay, doing well.
That's good. So in terms of the significance of the Israeli military's withdrawal from Khan Yunis and its impact on the rest of the conflict in Gaza, how would you perceive it?
I don't see it as changing the fundamental plans of Israel. You know, we have to understand that that Hamas and Gaza represent the last bastion of resistance to Israeli settler colonialism. In other words, if it can quietize and pacify Gaza and dismantle Hamas, certainly as a military force, Israel is really home free to impose an apartheid regime on all of Palestine. We can't, lose the focus on the fact that, as terrible and as appropriately focused as we are on the Gaza situation, in fact, it's the West Bank into which Israel is expanding, so that we're in the end of a process in which Israel and Zionism have really taken over Palestine, are in the final steps of nailing down this apartheid system. And so right after the fighting subsides, according to Biden himself, Biden has announced that he's going to present his two-state plan, which is really a form of two-state apartheid. I mean, you're very familiar with it in South Africa. It'll be the Israeli state on 85% of Palestine and Palestinians locked into small enclaves in a kind of a Bantustan. And so Gaza fits into that because Gaza is the last, like I said, bastion of resistance. So I don't think this means a change in plans. I think Israel is removing the troops for two reasons. One of them is because they have nothing to do. They finished, except for Rafah, which is waiting, and they haven't given up on invading Rafah. The rest of Gaza has been pacified and cleared, basically, of Hamas. And all that's left is to make mistakes like bombing the world's central kitchen. There's no reason for them to stay and simply keep shooting. The other reason is that they're taking the troops out to rest them and retrain them and get them ready to go into Rafah. So I wouldn't see this as a withdrawal. I would see this as a kind of a temporary repositioning of troops outside in order to wait for the next few weeks, maybe months, before the invasion of Rafah. But Israel has not given up the idea of invading Rafah.
So you mentioned the concept of a settler colonial colony, right? Now, within the context of Gaza, what do you think their plans are? So we obviously seen an attempted annihilation of Gaza, both from a physical infrastructure perspective, but then obviously also from a human count or humanitarian perspective. So in terms of that settler colonial ideology that they're putting through, what is their next phase? What happens next in their plan, in your estimation?
Well, it's very interesting. Of all the settler colonial projects in the world, and there's been many, South Africa probably resembles what's happening in Israel-Palestine more than any other. And so here Israel has a problem, and that is that It's not like the Native Americans in the United States or Canada or the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, New Zealand. The Palestinians are a major population, half the population of this country, and more if the 5 or 6 million refugees return, and they haven't given up their national struggle, for their national rights and so on. And so the only way out for Israel to turn Palestine into Israel, the entire Palestine, to turn the whole of an Arab country into a Jewish country, while being unable to displace and throw out, half the population, which is Palestinian, that can't belong to a Jewish state, not being Jewish, is apartheid. And so I think Gaza fits into that. Now, Gaza is a problem because there's so many people there. So I think what Israel's going to try to do is to thin the population of Gaza. And there the international community might help. We have to be very careful because humanitarian aid can sometimes be a guise for much more nefarious purposes. For example, Canada has already announced it'll take a few tens of thousands of refugees, as if the people of Gaza they've been made refugees, and Israel wants them to get out, you see. And so in a way, by making Gaza uninhabitable and by then creating this huge population of refugees, Israel's asking the world, as if for the sake of the Gazans themselves, to remove them for humanitarian reasons. So if the United States took 50,000, England took, Britain took 40,000, France. In other words, if all these countries, Australia and who knows where, would take 10, 20, 50,000 refugees, so-called, from Gaza, Israel's going to be able to get rid of 1 million Gazans or more, and in that way to make Gaza manageable. Otherwise, Gaza really isn't manageable for Israel. It has to push it off to the international community. But Gaza is marginal to Israel. It doesn't really need Gaza for any reason. And so, again, what I'm saying is, even though we're focused on Gaza, the real political story is the West Bank. And that's where Israel is really right now mopping up. 24 Palestinian villages have been abandoned, driven out. The people have been driven out by these violent settlers who have become soldiers. And that's where the apartheid regime is really in its finishing stages. So Gaza, in a way, is marginal for Israel. And I think it's, again, the main reason it's in Gaza is to break the last bit of resistance to, the takeover of Palestine.
So if we just shift to the West Bank, because Professor, you raise a very valid point. Very often, and we've seen this over the last 20 years, when there's an escalation of violence taking place in Gaza specifically, there are things happening on the West Bank with regards to, land annexation, with regards to settler colonies being built, etc., etc. But because of our focus being on humanity or human lives being lost, we end up not focusing on what is happening in the West Bank. So currently, could you unpack for us and our viewers, what would be the situation right now while the world's attention and cameras and everybody's talking about Gaza and the genocide, and legitimately so, what is actually happening in the West Bank at the moment?
At the moment, what's happening is that, like I said, Israel is involved in mopping up operations. In other words, it has enough settlements. There are 750,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They have a whole highway system that incorporates the West Bank into Israel proper. It's impossible today to detach the West Bank as any kind of coherent Palestinian state in any way. So again, the only thing you can do with the Palestinians is to confine them to small enclaves in what we call areas A and B, and then Gaza, on about 15% of historic Palestine. And so Israel's in the process of doing that. But, Israel can only do that. It can only build settlements and create the infrastructure of apartheid with international support. So the United States gives Israel support in the UN, in the Security Council. Europe certainly supports Israel. And so, so that's happening on that level. But what we have to also understand is that the United States and Europe have bigger fish to fry, so to speak, in the Middle East. The Palestinian issue is always seen as a pesky one, as a nuisance. It isn't really a major issue for the bigger powers. Their problems in the Middle East are China, that's trying to make inroads. Biden announced IMAC, the India-Middle East corridor, which is a kind of a counter to the Road and Belt project for the Chinese. They're concerned about Russia coming in. BRICS in general, of which South Africa is a part, is a real threat to Western hegemony in the Middle East, especially because Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have now joined BRICS. So those are the big geopolitical issues. And the problem with Palestine is it's a nuisance. It disrupts things. Because the governments, all the Arab governments want to normalize with it. All the pro-Western Arab governments want to normalize with Israel. But, they're faced with opposition from the street. The peoples of the Arab world certainly do not want to normalize with Israel and support the Palestinians. So the question is this, in a nutshell, if I can, and that is, how do we impose an apartheid regime over the Palestinians, but make it sweet enough that both the Arab world and the collaborationist Palestinian leadership of the Palestinian Authority will accept it? Can we make it cosmetically look a little nicer by maybe connecting some of the enclaves? Can we give them a few $1 billion, especially the elites, to buy them off? Maybe recognize, we'll call the Bantustan a state, and you'll be in the UN. In other words, all these things to sweeten the deal, but nevertheless, you have apartheid. That doesn't matter, because the point is to quietize the Palestinian issue so we can get on to the bigger issues of normalization in the Middle East, of which Israel is really a part. And so we really have to be careful that the international community, including the pro-Western Arab countries, don't sell out the Palestinians for their bigger economic and hegemonic interests. And that's really the danger. So Palestinians face a danger from Israel immediately in terms of living under apartheid, but it's only possible because they also face the fact that governments in the world, especially Europe, the United States, and the pro-Western Arab countries, also want the normalization and will accept the apartheid. And that's the danger the Palestinians face.
So I think two last questions. The one is with regards to the apartheid state, and obviously it would be called by a different name, right? The reality is if you look at the vast majority of governments around the world, almost everybody talks about a two-state solution. And based on what I'm inferring from what Professor is saying, is that the two-state solution becomes possible under the guise of an apartheid state. And in the language of South Africa and the language of apartheid South Africa, it's to give them the Bantustan. So like, this is your little area, and within that you operate. I ask the question I ask is, how does that exist within this current sort of euphoria? And when I say euphoria, I mean it in the context of there's a rise of Palestinian awareness globally, specifically in the West. And the citizens of the West in Western countries are, I think, waking up to a different kind of understanding with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My question is how does that actually impact geopolitics and elections coming up all across the world? If the citizens are moving in a particular direction, though the political elite might be wanting to usher in, as you say, an apartheid-style Bantustan and phrase it as a two-state solution.
Well, it's true. There's tremendous outpourings of support for Palestinians all over the world. And it's beginning to go into governments as well. The problem is, I'm involved with a Palestinian-led organization called the One Democratic State Campaign. The problem the Palestinian people face, they have a collaborationist leadership, that's been imposed on them, by the United States, basically. The Palestinians are lacking an ANC. They had the PLO, but the PLO, that was really the liberation organization and it connected all the scattered Palestinian communities all over the Middle East and all over the world, was dismantled basically by Arafat when he took over the Palestinian Authority. And even though Abu Mazen is the chair, it's moribund. It doesn't exist. And therefore, the problem is, with all the support the Palestinians have, they're lacking a political end game. When we were all boycotting South Africa in the apartheid days, we all knew why. The ANC's end game was one person, one vote. That was the political program. Palestinians don't have that. The Palestinian authorities is still talking about two states. Some are talking about one state, like our group. Some are talking about federations. There's all kinds of ideas out there. But in the absence of a real focused political program that I think has to be one democratic state over the entire country, there's no leadership that the Palestinian people can give to this international outpouring of people. You can support Palestinian rights in South Africa, but you don't have anything to advocate for because there is no Palestinian articulated political program. And that's our fatal flaw. And that's something that I'm trying to work with the Palestinians to try to provide. I have a book called Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, that really sets out the 10-point political program of the One Democratic State campaign. So that's the missing piece, I think.
Thank you so much, Professor. Last question. Just yesterday, we received news that a Palestinian prisoner, Walid Daka, who was in prison for 38 years, or let's say detention in Israeli prison for 38 years. And the Palestinian Affairs Commissioner said that his death is due to deliberate medical negligence. And obviously, this is the slow killing of Palestinians by the Israeli occupation authorities. So just your thoughts on that, and obviously that specific instance, but also the broader detention system, specifically that is implemented in the West Bank.
This is probably the most painful aspect of everything for Palestinians, are the political prisoners. There's about 5,000 political prisoners. Israel calls them security prisoners, who are part of the resistance movement. And Walid was the one that was in prison almost the longest of everyone. They're denied basic human rights. They're even denied books. They're denied the basic physical facilities. They certainly, are brutalized in prison, never have their terms shortened. You also have now thousands of Palestinians that have been arrested in administrative detention with no trial and no charges and held indefinitely, including many children. So this is a part of, Adamir and other Palestinian organizations are really trying to focus on this. This is a huge issue for Palestinians. I think it's gotten lost in the bigger Gaza and the bigger conflict that exists. But this is really crucial for Palestinians. And these are the Palestinian freedom fighters that are in prison. And one reason, just to connect these two questions, that there is no Palestinian leadership on the ground, there is no political program, is that Israel, and I would say the PA as well, but certainly Israel, kills or imprisons every single Palestinian potential leader that emerges, from the age 12 up. So if, people always ask, where's the Palestinian Mandela? Well, I'll tell you exactly where the Palestinian Mandela is. He or she is either dead or in prison. So prison isn't only imprisoning people, it's really imprisoning all of those that could be those leaders for Palestinian liberation. And Israel knows that. And that's why this prisoner issue is so crucial, again, for Israel's ability to impose this apartheid regime with a collaborationist leadership, because the real leadership is either dead or in prison.
Mhm. That was Professor Jeff Halper, who was unpacking for us in the beginning the withdrawal or the statements of the withdrawal by the Israeli military from Khan Yunis and possibly Rafah. And then also just unpacking the geopolitics of what the possibility of a Palestinian state would look like, its comparison to South African apartheid, and just the broader implications of Palestinian or the lack of Palestinian leadership. Thank you so much, Professor, and we hope to have you back soon.
And Ramadan Kareem to you and all your listeners.
Thank you so much. Thank you.